Industrialization inspired many European powers, all striving to gain resources to fuel their industrial revolution, yet competing against each other for other new markets for their goods. Many nations viewed Africa as a major source of raw materials, and as a market for industrial products, therefore sparking an age of mass colonization throughout Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries, known as the Scramble for Africa.
Before the Scramble for Africa, Africa had many loosely defined boundaries. There were thousands of different tribal groups and cultures throughout Africa that caused frequent fighting and transculturation. Europeans only controlled small areas along the coast and a short distance inland along the Niger and Congo rivers. It was hard for them to gain more central land due to diseases such as malaria.
Previously, the slave trade dominated the west coast of Africa. The end of the slave trade was sparked by England successfully stopping the trade along the coast of Africa, and Muslim traders north of the Sahara and on the east coast traded inland with local chiefs who were reluctant to stop using slaves but eventually did.
During the 19th century, there were many European expeditions into Africa triggered by the International African Association. They started off exploring out of pure curiosity. However, their focus shifted towards the economic benefits, and they began to record details of markets, goods, and resources for the wealthy philanthropists who financed their trips.
Technological advances allowed Europe to enter Africa. Europeans had new weapons like the Maxim gun, while Africans only had simple weapons like spears. Medical advances also allowed Europeans to overtake Africa. Quinine allowed Europeans to go more deeply into Africa. It kept them from getting sick and prevented malaria. Military innovation kept Europe alive in Africa. Europe kept building up their military to make it stronger, and it also allowed Europe to easily enter Africa.
Social Darwinism brought upon the idea that a human can be superior towards another human, as well as being placed on a scale of ranking between races. Because the Europeans saw themselves as superior compared to the Africans, this created racism, which made them more eager to colonize Africa. As the Europeans began to colonize Africa, the Africans became nationalistic to their section/country because they didn't want to be controlled by a different country with a different culture than their own.
The three C's of European society were commerce, Christianity, and civilization, which were used to westernize the African population. European powers had colonies along the coasts of Africa, but they wanted to move further inland. Many European Christian missionaries set out to explore and expand into Africa, such as David Livingstone. David Livingstone was a medical missionary and explorer who discovered many bodies of water across Africa that were previously uncharted by Europeans.
David Livingstone used quinine to treat malaria and created the theory that malaria was linked to mosquitoes. He also wanted to abolish slavery after he witnessed the horrors of the slave trade, and he wrote many books about his discoveries and explorations in Africa and about his medical theories. King Leopold II was the King of Belgium who governed the most infamous cruelties of forced labor in the Congo Free State during the early 1900s. He created the International African Association with Henry Morton Stanley. They financed expeditions and made treaties with local chiefs and set up occupation posts along the Congo River and in the east. The goals of the International African Association were to end interior slave trade and to civilize the native population. Each European country wanted to be dominant over their territories, regardless of the equal distribution of the power of Europe. This type of rule, used by King Leopold II, was known as direct control and was based on domination and subordination.
Otto von Bismarck, the Prime Minister of Prussia, organized the Berlin Conference to address diplomatic and political problems arising from European expansion into Africa. All 14 European states attended the conference, but no African representatives were present because they were seen as uncivilized.
They wanted to create a free trade region in the Congo Basin to reduce disputes among European states. European powers wanted to agree that the Congo and Niger River would be neutral and open for trade because the European powers struggled when it came to gaining African land. The General Act was signed at the Berlin Conference on February 26, 1885, for access to the Congo and Niger rivers for all nations. The Europeans suppressed the slave trade to help the well-being of the native African population.
Karl Peters was leader for Germany during the Scramble for Africa. He founded the Society for German Colonization in order to carve out German theory influence in East Africa, while also making a plan to establish a market that would benefit the German economy. This plan included the acquisition of appropriate colonial capital, finding and purchasing suitable territories for colonization, and directing German emigration to these areas.
The Suez Canal is an artificial waterway in Egypt that connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It enabled ships to travel from Europe to Asia without having to sail all the way around Africa, which improved the efficiency of commerce, communication, and transportation. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte envisioned the transformation of Egypt into a French colony. However, J.M. Lapierre, an engineer, miscalculated the measurement of the seas, preventing them from constructing the canal. The ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, and the Ottoman Sultan feared that the canal would intrude into the autonomy of Egypt. Britain also supported the Ottoman state that was against Russia's expansion into the Mediterranean and thus opposed the construction of the canal as well.
Bernadette de Lesseps was a French entrepreneur, engineer, and diplomat. He received 92% of financial backing from French investors and the Egyptian government to establish a private Egyptian-registered construction company known as the Suez Canal Company in order to construct the canal across the Isthmus of Suez. Although at first the canal's financial success was not great, Britain saw its potential and quickly acquired these shares for its government, making Britain the largest shareholder of the Suez Canal Company in Egypt.
The Zulu War of 1879 was fought between the British and the Zulu nation of South Africa, which was ruled by Shaka Zulu. Causes of the Zulu War were the expansion of Boers into South African territory, the attempt by the Zulu kingdom to defend their own independence, and the strict policy of the British to control South Africa by imposing their authority over the Boer and the Zulu. The British defeated the Zulu and divided their kingdom among pro-British African chiefs, which was done intentionally to cause years of civil war between the Zulu chiefdoms. The Zulu War marked the end of the independence of the Zulu nation and the beginning of British colonialism in South Africa.
Cecil Rhodes was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in 1881. He expanded the British Empire into Africa with the British South Africa Company and colonized the present-day countries of Zimbabwe and Zambia. Cecil Rhodes believed the transportation industry was more stable than his family diamond industry. Therefore, he constructed the unfinished railway that ran from the Cape of South Africa to Cairo, Egypt.
Europeans migrated because of the industrialization and the increase of machines and factories that replaced the manual labor and resulted in high unemployment rates. There was also a high demand for many resources that were abundant throughout Africa, sparking their interest in exploring and expanding further into Africa. The Great Flood took place between 1835 and 1837. About 12,000 Boers migrated northward from the Cape Colony to establish independent states across the Orange River. In 1852, Britain renounced its authority over the Transvaal region, also known as the South African Republic. Then in 1854, the British also recognized the independence of the Orange Free State.
The Boer Wars were fought between the Boers, who were the white descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa, and the British because the British Empire wanted to establish control over the two Boer republics, Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The First Boer War occurred from 1880 through 1881, and the Boers were defeated. In the Treaty of Pretoria, Britain granted independence to the South African Republic, but under a British protectorate.
In 1886, gold was discovered in the Transvaal region, and Europeans migrated in large masses to Africa to control the mines and recruit African labor, sparking the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. Lord Herbert Kitchener of the British forces established a harsh plan against the Boers. He intensified the scorched earth policy and destroyed Boer homes and crops to deplete their supplies. He also created concentration camps and confined numerous Boer citizens as well as black Africans. Thus, the Boers did not have the resources to continue fighting, and Britain won the war. The Scramble for Africa can be related to the AP theme, Interaction Between Humans and the Environment. Europeans brought new diseases and illnesses, which killed off much of the native African population. Along with these diseases, over 30 million Africans were carried away as slaves to America, not including the several millions who died in the slave raids and those who died on the way to the coast. Those taken away were primarily in the youth and the young adults who had energy and strength to work. The further development of the African countries were dependent on the work of the elders. Furthermore, the diseases present throughout Africa prevented Europeans from expanding inland. However, due to industrialization, the Europeans developed more advanced technology that enabled them to expand.
The Scramble for Africa can be related to the AP theme Development and Interaction of Cultures. While the British were trying to end the slave trade and spread the beliefs of Christianity, many native Africans continued to preach the Islamic faith in West Africa. However, Christian missionaries offered some advantages besides salvation and a new faith. They provided a link between African and European rulers who might have arms or other commodities to trade. Christianity also introduced literacy to the Africans because it is essential to the religion, and therefore Christianity educated the African people. The map of Africa changed from a collection of loosely defined ethnic territories into a series of fixed colonial states. Slave trade across the Atlantic came to an end. Europeans expanded throughout the inland territories of Africa rather than remaining along the coastal regions of the continent. Many new diseases had a negative impact on the African population as well.
Liberia and Ethiopia were the only countries to remain independent throughout Africa. Also, although slavery ended, racism continued among the African population. For example, labor was given the tougher jobs and more harsh working conditions. Scramble for Africa also had a large global significance. New raw materials and resources gained from Africa allowed industrialization to occur more rapidly throughout Europe. Trade also increased throughout the world due to new resources that were available from Africa. Due to the end of the slave trade, slavery decreased in many countries as they were unable to get slaves from Africa. Throughout the Scramble for Africa, many countries throughout Europe gained multiple colonies that helped to increase their economy. The Scramble for Africa had a strong relationship with industrialization. For example, countries wanted more raw materials and resources to help with their own industrialization. New raw materials and resources that they gained from Africa allowed their industrialization to occur more rapidly. Also, new weapons like the Maxim gun allowed easy access to Africa, and quinine allowed Europeans to more deeply enter Africa while preventing them from diseases such as malaria.
The Scramble for Africa had a major significance on the development of Africa. New diseases were introduced into Africa brought in by the Europeans. Africa was carved up and broken into thousands of different colonies governed by different countries. The slave trade ended, but racism still continued to grow. Tribal communities transformed into structured, centralized governments.
My